can see some friendly faces in the crowd. I experienced a lot of technical difficulties. Did you see me freaking out like 5 minutes ago? I was like, you can't open my deck. I'm like, already nervous, this is bad. I'm Shannon Tran. It's really nice to meet all of you. Some of you might know me as Shannon Howe if you met me before I was married. So today we're going to be talking about integrations. If you're in the wrong room, you can stay if you want. But feel free to leave. It's fine if this is not the right place for you. I have my blog address, my email address up there. It's salesforcefinesse.com. I highly encourage you to check it out. You can always reach me, Shannon@salesforcefinesse.com. I have a Deloitte email as well. Can I get a hoorah or a hey or a woohoo from the Deloitte people in the room? Yes, that's my team. So I love Deloitte. Come talk to me about working there after this session if you're interested in making a change. And then finally, I'm going to do my Twitter plug too. I'm Shan Francisco on Twitter. That's spelled Shan Tran, Cisco, like San Francisco. So feel free to tweet me as well. So before we get started, I'm sure you've all seen this slide a million times today, but don't make any purchasing decisions based on anything that I say during this session. Cool. So a little bit more personal branding. I already went through most of this. The one thing I want to share with everybody in this room is I had a goal to earn my integration domain before I got to Dreamforce. And I fell really short of that goal because I didn't even sit for it. So I'm going to make a promise to everybody in the room that I'm going to sit for this exam by the end of next month, and I'm going to pass it because I'm going to learn all of the material I need, and I'm going to earn that exam certification. So hopefully the next time you see me, I'll have some more certifications on my slide. So who's excited to learn about integrations? Are we ready? No. Are we ready? Yes. Okay, cool. So let's get started. Where do we start? So integrations usually come into play when we're talking about multiple systems, right? So we have ERPs, we have MDMs, we have Salesforce. So there's so many systems. And systems can get confusing because we need to know what, when, why are we integrating? We're going to cover that and how we can get to those answers and the kinds of questions that I need you to ask before you even think about integrating anything. But then we also have these cool terms that people will use on the fly, like API and SOAP and REST and bulk. How many of you feel really comfortable using those terms today? A few of you. Okay, so at the end of the session, I hope that everybody's able to raise their hands when I ask that same question again, that how many of you feel more comfortable talking about integrations and using these terms? So let's start talking about integration basics. So when I say integration basics, we're going to be talking about the most bizarre restaurant you've ever heard of. And it's Shannon's Pizza Sushi Place, because I like pizza and I love sushi. And wouldn't it be great if there was a pizza sushi restaurant? Did you already know that they exist in real life, in the wild? Because they do, which is pretty interesting. So what I'm going to be doing throughout today's session is I'm going to be talking about integrations in terms of our pizza sushi restaurant. It's not meant to confuse you. It's meant to actually help you learn the concepts behind some of the things we're talking about. So let's get started. So what is an API? So it's an application programming interface, duh. But what does that actually mean? So let's think of APIs as a restaurant menu of services. So when we walk into a restaurant, we have a menu of things that we're able to order. So systems are restaurants. And when we walk into our system, the system's capable of providing us with different things. Everybody following so far? Cool. So when we walk into our restaurant, we're going to order a cucumber roll, or an avocado roll, or breadsticks. And our chef is going to know what those are, because they're the same every time somebody orders them. The cucumber roll is always cucumbers and rice and seaweed. The avocado roll is always avocado, rice, and seaweed. And the breadsticks are my holy grail favorite food group, bread in stick form. Can you tell I'm hungry? So APIs are reusable and repeatable. And it's beautiful because it means that we can control who's ordering what. So you can't come into my restaurant and order breadstick sushi. That does not exist. And sure, you can give me a 1-star Yelp review for that, because I'm not going to let you order that off the menu, because it doesn't exist on the menu. And finally, what we're talking about, and the way that we're talking about this menu, is it provides this communication between different services. So we have maybe a customer wants to do something. They're going to use their language. They're going to order off the menu. The server's going to understand what's being said to them. They're going to walk that order back to the kitchen. The kitchen's going to know how to make whatever they're needing to make. So the API has provided that baseline menu of items that we can order. Everybody understand what an API is now? Yes? Cool. So now that we know what an API is, we can start to talk about the integration pattern approach. So the next several slides in my deck closely mirror, I don't want to say mirror, but they closely follow the integration practices guide, which I've linked in the very last slide of my deck, the resource slide. So Salesforce puts together release notes and guides for like everything, right? So what I've done is I've tried to take the integration best practices that Salesforce provides and break it down in a way that we can talk about restaurants, menu, food, etc., to help people who maybe aren't so technical understand some of the more technical concepts of integration practices. Does that make sense? So this will kind of follow along the guide that is linked at the end of the deck. It's just not quite as technical, and we are talking more in terms of our restaurant, pizza, sushi place. Okay. So with source and target, what exactly is a source and what exactly is a target? And why do I even care? So my restaurant might sell food to people, but restaurants don't just make food appear, right? Like they connect with distributors who bring them ingredients, who then the restaurant can prepare certain things, put it in the freezer, get ready for the customers to come in. Sounding familiar? We've all been to a restaurant before, right? So there's like a process that happens for the restaurant to even be able to sell food. So it could be that I have a food distributor in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I'm going to order dough from them. And they're my source. And my restaurant is in San Francisco, so I'm the target. So similarly, we might have data in Salesforce that's created and owned upstream of Salesforce. Those sources that are upstream of Salesforce, like a master data management system, those are your source. And then if you want to expose that data to somebody in Salesforce, Salesforce is your target. Pretty cool, right? So our food distributor is in Michigan. My restaurant's in San Francisco. Our source could be the MDM, and our target would be Salesforce. Cool. So that's what we mean by source and target. What are we talking about when we talk about frequency? So frequency is another important thing when we're talking about source and target, because let's say my food distributor changes their options that I'm able to order as a restaurant owner every month. Let's say that I'm a very eager new restaurant owner, and I want to change my menu tomorrow. Well, if my food distributor just changed what they're able to provide me, and maybe I want to order something completely different from them, but it's not on their current offering list, that doesn't mean that I'm going to call them every day for the next several weeks if their options only ever change on a monthly basis. Because what could happen is I'd tarnish that relationship, right? Like, hey, have you guys changed your offerings yet? They're like, no, Shannon, you called us yesterday with that question. We make changes to our offerings once a month. Why are you calling us again? Gets annoying, right? So it's really important to understand what's available to us and when it's available to us when we're talking to our sources. Does it make sense? Cool. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about frequency. It's the timing of the source. How often does our distributor get those new products or those new offerings? There's another thing that we should talk about when we're talking about our source and target information, and that's going to be volume. So by volume, I don't mean how loud the music is in my restaurant. I mean the size of my shipment from my food distributor. So if I say to my food distributor, I need 2 million sushi rolls on my next shipment, they're going to say to me, our truck's not big enough for that, and also, why are we giving you those? But when we're talking about volume, it's really important because of constraints. So there are certain technical reasons that we can't do certain things. So like maybe our truck isn't big enough to carry whatever I'm ordering, or maybe a system's not capable of giving me the number of records that I want. So there are technical constraints when we're talking about integrations that are super important to know. Another thing that we need to learn when we're talking about integration patterns would be the type of integration. So just out of curiosity, how many of you think there's more than 5 types of integrations? No hands, 1 hand. How many think there's maybe less than 5? Okay, that was a trick question. Nobody raised their hands either time. Come on, people. I know it's after lunch. There's actually 2 main types of integration patterns. There's data integration patterns, which are simpler, things like that MDM, where we're passing data from a source into Salesforce. It's not process-based. That's the second type. So process-based is where we have multiple hands, multiple tasks, multiple systems doing something to carry through a process. So the simpler one is data integration. The more complex one is process-based. Lord knows if I'm in a kitchen, if you know me at all and I've ever told you about my cooking experiences, things get broken really quickly on process-based integrations if you don't know exactly what you're doing. So those are usually the scarier ones for me to build because they're more complex. And because they're more complex, there's more that can go wrong, right? So in my pizza sushi restaurant, if I don't know exactly how to make a cucumber roll, which even though it sounds simple, I'm pretty sure I could screw it up, then my server downstream of me trying to make that cucumber roll, they're going to have a hard time explaining why a cupcake was given to my customer. I won't because I can't make anything, so I just opened up my cupcake box and gave them a cupcake instead. But when we're talking about process integrations, it's super easy for something like that to occur where a process broke upstream of our integration, before our integration even started. And because of that, downstream systems and processes are completely messed up. So now that we've talked about type, we can talk about timing. So there are 2 buzzwords that I hope that everybody can use when we leave this session. And they're buzzwords that I use all the time, and I use them out of context all the time too. And those are synchronous and asynchronous. We'll start with synchronous. Synchronous means blocking, near real time, and I like to remember the definition by the alliteration. It's sequential. So synchronous starts with an S, sequential starts with an S. And what does that mean? That it means that the integration is following a very specific cadence to continue. And it means that we care about what's happening and when it's happening. So with synchronous, an example in our restaurant could be that a customer is ordering food, the chef prepares the food, I wasn't in the kitchen, and then the customer received the food and was super happy with what they were given, and then they ate their food. So that could be an example of a synchronous integration. Certain things happen in a specific order. The food just didn't arrive before the customer ordered it. That would be an example of asynchronous. Asynchronous is non-blocking. It's typically one-way communication. Like the customer left a voicemail over the weekend. Will I get back to them? Who knows? It's my crazy restaurant. I do what I want. But that would be an example of asynchronous. Asynchronous is usually something you see with high volume too. But we'll talk more about that in a second. But now we know the 3 major components for our integration pattern approach. So now that we know the 3 major components of the integration pattern approach, we can talk about the actual integration patterns themselves. So again, this mirrors the integration patterns and practices that Salesforce has put out in a guide that I've linked to the back of this deck. That guide gets very technical very quickly. This is less technical. I'm going to say that a couple of times because I love that guide. It's really great. So the first integration pattern that we're going to talk about is request and reply. So request and reply, what does that sound like to you? For me, when I hear request reply, I immediately think of CTI, your telephony. So your CRM and your telephony, has anybody installed CTI, by the way? A couple of people. Some people look like they're going through it. So your CRM and your CTI are coupled, and they're constantly talking to each other, and they're sending each other signals. So it's request and reply. It's typically with low volume. So you see this integration type with low volume. So again, that means not a ton of records, not a ton of data. It's real-time and synchronous. So near real-time and synchronous. So again, synchronous is sequential. Things happen in a specific order. So that's an example of request and reply. And we've learned one integration pattern. Can I give everybody in the room a round of applause? Give yourselves a round of applause. We made it to one integration pattern, and a few years ago, I couldn't tell you that I would ever be doing this and even talking about integrations, and now I just told an entire room about an integration pattern, so I'm really happy. Even though that round of applause was super weak, come on guys, I'm proud to say that I did that. So let's talk about our second integration pattern, fire and forget. So what does that sound like? It sounds like that voicemail that I left and forgot about, right? The customer called, I totally didn't care, whatever, I do what I want. So it's like sending orders downstream to systems for processing, but never getting a response about that order, right? So if you're sending an order downstream for processing and you just don't care what happens with that order afterwards, that would be an example of fire and forget, and that's not a very good implementation in my opinion. Typically low volume. So this is something, you see this integration pattern, not with a ton of records, and it's asynchronous. So, I called and left a message. I don't care what happens after that. So I could call in the middle of the night, or I can call tomorrow morning, or I could call tomorrow afternoon. It doesn't matter what sequence I'm calling. So that would be fire and forget. Let's talk about our third integration pattern. Batch data synchronization. So this is where it gets tricky. I'm going to start quizzing everybody, and I'm going to need more participation than you guys were giving me earlier. So an example of batch data synchronization would be to send backup data to a data warehouse on a weekly basis. So I'm kind of giving away the answer, but does anybody feel confident enough to tell me whether this is high volume or low volume? High volume. Yes, you are correct. Come up here and claim your prize. Actually, I don't have anything. Yes, high volume. So this would be an example of high volume. That's why we would use this integration pattern. And it's asynchronous. So again, asynchronous, don't necessarily care about the timing for this one. It's high volume. We're going to be sending that data once a week into our data warehouse. All right. Is everybody getting ready for their next quiz? Because there's another one coming up. Let's talk about remote call-in. So an example of a remote call-in is we're going to connect and authenticate remote systems with Salesforce. Little trickier example. Can anybody tell me whether this is going to be high volume or low volume? High or low? So it depends on the API that we're using when we're building that remote call-in. So typically low volume. Safe to say and assume low volume. However, it could be high volume. It could also be disastrous either way. And it's synchronous or asynchronous because, again, it depends on the API, it depends on the business requirement, it depends on how we're building this out. But typically, asynchronous for this one. If it's low volume, we can be asynchronous for most of the business processes that I've seen. I did have a colleague tell me that he wrote a synchronous low volume remote call-in integration as well, though. So just be aware that this one's tricky. Can anyone guess what our last integration pattern is? There's a CTA sitting in like the third row that I keep looking at because I can hear his thoughts. But all right, user interface update. So what does this sound like? So we're alerting customers when their account balance falls beneath a certain threshold. So how many of you have ever received an alert similar to this one? Maybe your account balance grew by a certain amount. There are a couple hands. You guys should, I have a couple of customers in here that you guys should talk to, because maybe your bank needs to change. But yeah, so like if I get an alert when I need to move money from my checking to my savings, if my checking balance is too high, I get an alert to tell me that. I also get the adverse alert if my checking dips too low to move that money from savings into checking. So that's an example of a user interface update. Can anybody tell me whether this is high volume or low volume? Low volume. Awesome. Congrats. And can anybody tell me whether this would be asynchronous or synchronous? I heard some correct answers. Synchronous. So this is going to follow a specific process, right? Because I had to do something to hit that threshold of needing the bank to tell me that I hit a threshold. So this is synchronous, and certain things happen at certain times. So we've made it through all of our integration patterns. What the heck is a WSDL? So we talked about language, right? We talked about these acronyms that people throw out there. And so WSDL translates to Web Services Description Language. How many of you understand what that means? That's significant hands. All right, so if you've ever used XML, then WSDL will seem very familiar to you because it's an XML-based description that describes functionality offered by a web service. So XML is like this kind of silly skeletal-looking thing if you're looking at it, but you can kind of pick out parts of whatever you're looking at. So if you're comfortable with HTML, XML is very, very similar. So WSDLs are XML-based. So all of what I just said, they're just a different way of showing data. Salesforce provides a few WSDLs, partner, enterprise, Apex, metadata, et cetera. So the Salesforce provides WSDLs for your integrations so that you can create your menu of orders or your APIs, right? And I like to think of WSDLs as like a help file to figure out what's possible and also how do I do it. So when I download my WSDLs on Salesforce, I can see what does this API provide and how do I make it happen. And for the theme of our restaurant, which is the strangest place I've never eaten, our WSDL could contain things like add sushi to your pizza as a topping. This is a thing. So that's our WSDL. Let's talk more about SOAP API. So now that we know what a WSDL is, we can start exploring SOAP API. So SOAP stands for Simple Object Access Protocol. And using a WSDL, we can create a SOAP API request. So the first part of creating an API request is really having that WSDL for SOAP to work. So SOAP cannot just exist by itself. We have to have the WSDL because it tells us what's available to us. And then SOAP API kind of sits on top of that, and that's where we would build based on what's in our WSDL. So we have 20 plus out-of-the-box calls to create and retrieve and update and delete data in Salesforce available via the Salesforce SOAP API. The SOAP API is super mature and robust, so it's a great menu. It's been around forever, and things on it work, and the customers like what they're getting. It's best with low volume updates. So SOAP API is different from some of the other APIs we're going to talk about, but when you're designing an integration, you need to figure out which API you're going to use. Not only the integration pattern itself, but how we're going to build it, the actual technical details. So this one's important because it's low volume, and if you found that you're building something that requires high volume, this is not the best practice. And then finally, we can order our off-menu pizza in French if we'd like with SOAP API. So we can build very custom things with SOAP API. It doesn't have to exist on our menu as is. It's not necessarily always going to be plug and play. We can build out something custom via SOAP API. So if my system wants to do something crazy, we can make it do something crazy in the integration. Now that we've talked about SOAP, let's talk a little bit about the unique factors. So you're going to see this on both this slide and the slide following, and it's because these two are important to know what the big differences are. So the unique factors of SOAP API is that it uses web services to do the work. which is super important. It uses web services to do the work. You'll see why in a second. And that it supports XML. So how many of you are developers? Okay, so this only supports XML. How many of you that raised your hands know JSON? This does not support JSON. Sorry, Jason. Okay, all right. So REST API or RESTful API. I like to say RESTful API because it's like saying you're going to Target. It just makes it sound fancier, but it's basically the same thing. It is the same thing. Representational state transfer. That's what REST is. There are 3 parts to REST. The URI, the Uniform Resource Identifier, which is the address for our action. The HTTP method, which is head, get, post, patch, or delete, which is our action. And then the request, which is the headers and the body, the specific details. So these 3 things, what does that sound like? What is this looking like so far? Like a URL. So this is best with low volume updates. Again, low volume. We're gonna get to bigger volumes, I promise. But this API is best with low volume updates. And I like to think of it as ordering pizza. And you can't see my last little words because it's a little different on this version of PowerPoint. Sorry, I had technical difficulties, girl. So ordering pizza. So we're gonna order our pizza. That would be our URI. So our pizza is URI. The HTTP method would be I want to bake that pizza. So that's the main verb, I'm baking a pizza. And the request would be, I'm gonna bake it at 350 until the sushi toppings are golden and dry and the rice on the bottom is burnt. So that's the specific details of how I'm going to bake that pizza. I know it doesn't sound appetizing, but I think it could be really good. But anyway, our REST API, again, low volume. We can build out something crazy. We're gonna use our 3 parts. The main thing, what we're doing with that integration, the pizza, the verb for that integration, which is baking, and then the request, which is the specific details of that integration. The unique factors of REST. It uses the URL to do work. So remember I said it sounded like a URL. This is a main factor of this integration. And then this one supports JSON. So it supports XML and JSON. So this is a great API if you're a JSON developer. Bulk API, so what does that sound like so far? Are we low volume or high volume here? High, cool. So I said we'd get there. This is a REST-based API. So what we just learned about, we're gonna bring all that forward. The main difference here is bulk API is high volume. Large sets of data. So the staff are collecting recycling in a dumpster behind our restaurant. So that dumpster is big, and we recycle a lot. So this is a large set of data. I can see some faces over on the Deloitte side. I also want to take a minute to pause. I am the worst PowerPoint person on our team, hands down. So I'm sorry if this next GIF or GIF, or however you'd like to say that, offends anyone. But anyway, so we're talking about large sets of data here with bulk API. So we have a big dumpster. We have a ton of records in that dumpster. We're lighting them all on fire behind our restaurant. And it's also asynchronous, right? Yep, so we're gonna roast some marshmallows. I don't know when we're gonna roast marshmallows. That fire's gonna be burning all week. But we're gonna go out there and we're gonna roast marshmallows before the dump truck or before the recycling truck comes and picks up our dumpster of records twice a week. So again, bulk API, large sets of data, asynchronous. Very similar to REST API because it is REST-based. Very cool. Is everybody following so far? Head nods, cool. And streaming API. So this one, really fun. What does it sound like? So push topics and generic streaming allocations. So push topics, and what does that even mean? So push topics are platform event push topics, which are predefined. So when we have that menu of items, these are things that are straightforward. Salesforce gives us these push topics which we can then use, but we don't have to make changes to it. They're pre-existing, they're fabricated, plug and play. Generic streaming topics are things where we can build something custom. So if we're using the streaming API, it's just important to know that we have sets, we have the push topics, which are out of the box, and then generic, which is when we would build something custom. The streaming API could be something where we're watching our order status on Postmates or GitHub. So how many of you guys stock your delivery drivers in your apps? Me too. When I'm really hungry, I'm really hungry. So there's a streaming API in the background that's doing things, and it's sending updates based on what's happening in real time, to me based on where that driver is and how long it's going to take them and whatever. And I just wish we had teleportation already because I'm tired of watching my screen move. I want my food right now. So that's an example of a streaming API use case. We're delivery stalking. So those are the different APIs. I can't believe we're already at final thoughts. So we've made it through. We talked about the integrations. We gave you that baseline information about what integrations are. We talked about the API. We talked about the menu of services. We talked about the key 5 different integration patterns. So you learned 5 of those today. So give yourself a round of applause. And then we went through the most important part, which was the APIs themselves and when you would use certain ones based on which pattern you were picking out. So now that you know what integrations are, I'm going to show you some tools that make your life a little easier, so maybe you don't have to remember half of what you just learned. So there's the native integrations, which we talked about. There's actually specific different ways that you can build these integrations. So check out outbound messages and then also Apex web services and platform events. So that would be the how to get started. There's a tool called Salesforce Connect. So Salesforce Connect offers really awesome declarative ways to build out your integrations with different systems. So you can bring external data into Salesforce and manipulate it somewhat. It's a little bit limited. And you can also connect Salesforce to Salesforce with Salesforce Connect. There's Integration Cloud. So Salesforce recently acquired MuleSoft. Pretty awesome because Integration Cloud is super robust. And it now features the MuleSoft platform as well. But you can build native and declarative integrations there too, so click and point. And then there are also other tools that are worth mentioning, like Informatica, Workato, and Boomi. So these are other tools that offer both custom integration and then also declarative features that you can build plug-and-play integrations with. So your cheat sheet. So we have a ton of trailheads. This isn't even all of them. These are just the ones that we talked the most about today. But I do recommend that you sit down and if you're interested in learning more about integrations, do some trailheads. We have documentation guides. My favorite one is the Integration Patterns and Practices Guide. You made it through almost 40 minutes of us going through that guide together. They don't talk about pizza sushi in the guide. I'm sorry. But we talked about pizza sushi today, and we did that following the guide, almost step by step. And then finally, I'm only going to make one call out on the Trailblazer community because I love the one that I'm going to show. And that's Ladies Be Architects. And there's a reason that I love the one that I'm showing up here. And that's because there's one of our Deloitte team members that is a part and a founder of Ladies Be Architects. So you need to check it out. Okay. Nobody's pulling out their phones. No, I'm being serious. So anyway, so this is your cheat sheet. Please come back to these guides. Do the trailheads. Mostly download the integration patterns and practices, and then check out Ladies Be Architects. All right. I want to say thank you before half the room leaves, because most of you probably don't have questions. But I also want to ask you one question. How many of you feel more comfortable talking about integrations leaving this room now that you've had this session? Thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope that you can go and talk about asynchronous and synchronous integrations in the hallway.